Hey there, and welcome to my tutorial about the color burn blending mode. We'll take a detailed look at how it works with the help of some interactive graphs that I programmed for this video, and later I'll show you a bunch of examples for how to use it. Color burn is in the group of darkening blending modes, and as such it can be used for adding shadows, vignettes and other things. Its darkening effect can be a bit extreme though, compared to other blending modes. And also, if you are not careful, you might encounter some unwanted RGB effects that make the end results very unpredictable. This is part of a long series of tutorials where I explain every single default blending mode that you can find in Photoshop and many other graphics programs. So, if you want to learn more about the others, check out the playlist and subscribe. Alright, let's get to it. Okay, gonna start with this graph here. To quickly explain how it works, on the bottom axis we have a gradient of colors which are going to be our base colors. With that I mean all the colors underneath the blending layer. And on the vertical axis we have the blending colors, so the colors on our blending layer. The colors in the graph itself are the actual resulting colors. So if you have this color on the base layer and this color on the blending layer, then this will be the color that you'll get. This particular graph uses the HSV color space, so hue, saturation and value. Other graphs will also use the HSL and HCL color spaces. If you want to better understand what these are, then I have made another video about that exact topic that I can highly recommend. Here in this graph we look at how the value changes, also called brightness. The curves show specific values and they change as I change the other parameters. Firstly, I want to show you what happens if you only mix reds at full saturation, because this shows what happens with the red channel of the RGB colors. The most obvious thing here is the fact that half of this graph turned black. This has to do with how the math works. Well, I can show you the actual formula, but it's a bit more complicated than the one for multiply, for example. So we won't pay too much attention to the formula itself. One thing is pretty easy to understand and very important though. This formula is asymmetrical. If you switch the base and blending colors, you would get a different result. And we can see this through the arrangement of the graph lines. They are not symmetric either, but instead converge towards the lower right corner here. If we look at the outer edges, we see very different behaviors. When you use the brightest red on the blending layer, you'll get the base color as a result. But if you use it on the base layer, then you will only get that red and nothing else. We can read something else from this too. If we had just vertical and or horizontal graph lines, then that would indicate no change in brightness for the most part. However, instead they are bent towards the right and upwards. The dark areas have a lot more room therefore, which means that there is an overall darkening effect happening. Well, at least in most cases, that is. There are more special rules and conclusions we can draw, but it's better to use another graph for that. So let's switch to the HSL graph that shows how the lightness changes. It's more useful than the HSV version because this shows the full range between black and white. Gonna start with pure reds again, and things are getting even weirder now. So this is basically separated into 4 quarters that show very different patterns. The lower left is the exact same as the HSV version. One half is black and then the lines converge to this point down here. If we look above that quarter, we can see perfectly vertical lines. This means that the result is always going to be the original dark base colors. The bright colors on the blending layer have no effect. The lower right area is exclusively pure red and nothing else. And then the upper right quarter shows the same pattern as the lower left one, but with pure red as the first half and a gradient towards white. The reason why they are so sharply segmented is because of the RGB values. When the lightness is below 50%, we only have red and nothing else. When it is above 50%, the red value is already at maximum, so green and blue are added in order to move towards white. and therefore you get these different patterns depending on whether you have some green and blue in the RGB colors or not. Alright, how about we finally start playing around with the sliders and mix some other colors together than just red. Firstly, let's shift the hue. We can see some new colors appearing, but the lines are not budging. That is, until we hit the point where we shifted 1/6 of the way on the hue scale. Up until that point we only added green, but now the red values are decreasing and we start seeing the lines move. They move towards the right, that is. The black dark areas are spreading further and the darkening effect increases. And then something crazy happens. At the 1/3 point, the lower right quarter suddenly flips over. The 1/3 point is where the blending colors don't have any red left anymore, at least when the saturation is at maximum. Even weirder is the fact that if the saturation for the blending color is just slightly lower, the flip does not happen. It always stays mostly red. And when the base color saturation is slightly lower, then the flip still happens. Then another weird thing is happening when we move the hue further towards the halfway point. The upper right quarter now forms these vertical lines, which tell us that the base colors remain completely unaffected by the blending colors. And moving beyond the halfway point simply shows the same, but just in reverse. Now if you use lower saturation values, then these extreme effects get a bit smoothened out. But it also depends on which saturation you lower. If I set the saturation of the base colors to 0, then we get a different result compared to if I do that for the blending colors. Even if one color is completely gray, the results are still quite hard to predict. The curves are very much all over the place. Only if both saturation values are quite low, the curves start to look more even. Until to the point where both are just gray, giving us the exact same curves that we had when we only looked at the red channel. But obviously, we usually don't just work with grays. Alright, so what conclusions can we draw from this? Firstly, using highly saturated colors, even if it's just one of them, can make your results very unpredictable. Are you gonna get pure black, a pure hue color, or something else? Very hard to tell. It's not realistic to expect a person to memorize something like, ah yes, the lightness of this color is above 50% and my blending colors have less than 50% lightness, so I will get this result. But you can at least remember something like, be aware of high saturations. That's what these conclusions are for. Secondly, the amount of darkening is affected by the hue difference. Combining hues that are far apart from each other will make your results even darker, at least on average. Now let's take a look at how the hue changes. This is going to get even crazier. Once again I'm using the HSL color space. At first I'll set the blending saturation to 0, while the lightness remains at 0.5. There are two things that are interesting here now. The first one is the fact that no darkening is happening for the base colors. The second one is that some of the hues got shifted, even though we're only using gray. The values of the lines correspond to specific hues. 0.6 for example is this specific blue. However, the line for 0.6 is over here to the left now. You might have noticed it already. It is particularly red, green and blue that got wider. Lowering the saturation for the base colors has no effect on the hue shift, but you can see that some darkening is occurring now. If we lower the lightness, then there's also some darkening happening, but also the RGB strips get even wider, until we reach the point where everything is just black. And if we increase the lightness and move towards white, then the hue shift gets reduced and things start to look more normal again. I'm gonna set the base color lightness back to 50% and I'll show you something even crazier. When I lower the blending color lightness, there's still no darkening, but the red, green and blue stripes start to swallow up almost all the other hues. And white has no effect on the base colors whatsoever. Now let's do this the other way around with the base color being gray. This time there is some darkening, but we still see the same wide red, green and blue stripes, just horizontal this time. Changing the blending color saturation again has no effect, other than making the resulting colors darker. Decreasing or increasing the blending color lightness also shows the same effects as before, with the hues getting more or less shifted. Let's change the base color lightness now. Moving towards black darkens everything and RGB colors get more dominant again. Now let's move towards white. The hues shift towards normal values again. But they don't stop there. They keep on shifting until we are suddenly only left with cyan, magenta and yellow, the secondary RGB colors. Another really crazy effect. Alright, gonna do something different now. I'll set the saturation values to 50% and the lightnesses to 90%. It's a bit vague, but you can see that the lines are almost perfectly vertical. Now I reduce the lightnesses to 80%. It's getting curvier. And as I reduce them more and more, the lines start to look quite weird. When we reach 50%, we see this extreme pattern. I'm sure you have noticed it right away. This mostly just shows red, green and blue colors. And reducing the lightnesses further will make this pattern even more extreme, until everything is just black. And this is happening with the saturations at 50%, mind you. And using even lower saturation still gives us this effect. Although with high saturations things get just absolutely nuts. The results sort of look like some kind of abstract art pieces. Let me change the lightnesses in auto mode because there are a lot of crazy patterns that can occur. If the blending lightness is quite high though, then the results can still look somewhat reasonable. But in other cases I cease to understand what even is going on. So we have some big conclusions to draw from this. The hue shifting can be enormously unpredictable. The RGB effects are really strong with this blending mode. Therefore, it can be quite hard to find colors that don't give you some kind of ridiculous result. If you use some bright colors on your blending layer, then you can still somewhat work with this, although the darkening effect might be quite inconsistent. I would definitely recommend to stay away from very dark colors, and I would also not advise using highly saturated colors. Alright, now that was quite something. We still wanna look at how the saturation gets affected though. Firstly, I'm gonna set the hue to just red again and the lightnesses to 50% each. Okay, why do we see no graph lines whatsoever? It's because all the resulting colors have full saturation, even when you combine these very grayish colors in the lower left corner. Only when I increase one of the lightnesses so that their sum is above 1, then we get some curves. Doesn't matter exactly how I combine them. Although sometimes the graph glitches out for some weird reason. In that case you can see where they would be though because of the grid lines that disappeared. But either way, the saturation always increases here compared to the base color. It might be lower than the blending color saturation though. And when we approach white for the blending colors, the lines get more and more perfectly vertical. However, when we raise the lightness of the base colors towards white, then the results are quite different. And for dark base colors it gets especially weird. Like here when we almost blend white and black, but still get these vibrant colors. Okay, let's pick some lightness combinations and shift the hues. Nothing is really happening until we reach the point where we traveled 1/6 of the way. They slowly start moving away from the lower left corner. And when we reach 1/3 of the way, then things really start moving. The curves stretch towards the upper right corner, and at the halfway point they reach their peak. So when you combine similar hues, the saturation gets raised, quite strongly too. However, if you blend opposite hues together, then the resulting saturation can actually be lower. Depending on the specific combinations, you could even end up with gray. What lightnesses you use has a very strong influence on the saturation though, which makes things a lot more unpredictable again. Like this state here, where along this diagonal line you could have a lower saturation, but outside of it you get pure maximum saturation. Our conclusion: the color burn blending mode makes the saturation values explode in most cases, especially if you combine similar hues. Only if you're using opposite hues of specific lightnesses, you could perhaps get lower saturations. This is very hard to predict and very chaotic. Only if you combine two relatively bright colors, where especially the blending color is quite bright, then the saturation will mostly stay what it originally was on the base layers. Alright, we talked about hue, saturation and lightness. Not really anything left, right? Well, I also prepared some graphs that use the HCL color space. So this one shows us how the perceptual lightness changes, which is how bright these colors actually appear to our human eyes. Up front, I have to say though that firstly, the hue is not quite the same as in HSL and HSV, and some chroma values might be unrealistic. Chroma stands for the vividness of a color, by the way. It is similar but quite different from saturation. That's why we don't always see a full gradient from black to white. But despite these inaccuracies, it still can give us some insights. And the mixed colors are still correct. Those are the results when you blend these blending and base colors together. We can still see the effects that we saw in the HSL lightness graph from before. Like for example that there is more darkening if you combine opposite hues. We still get this weird area in the lower right corner sometimes where we get a super vibrant color, which expands as we increase the chroma. However, I try to avoid using higher chroma values because those distort the graph quite a bit. You can see that if I raise it up very high, the darkest and brightest colors in the gradient down here diverge further from black and white. As I said, it has some flaws. Something I can do to demonstrate the usefulness of this graph is to set one of the colors to gray colors, like the base colors. When I shift the hue of the blending color now, we can see that the curves slightly move. That's because the different hues are differently bright to our human eyes, something that the HSL lightness parameter does not take into consideration. Now let me automate this so that all of these parameters cycle back and forth in different speeds, giving us all sorts of combinations. Now this is really funky to look at. And you can see that in some cases the hue colors are overpowering absolutely everything. And that is partially because of the unrealistic chroma values, but also because of how the color burn calculations work. We have seen before that this blending mode can really overblow the saturation values in some cases. So yeah, this has not really given us a whole lot of new insights, but it is still interesting to see how the perceptual lightness gets influenced. And this is also sort of mesmerizing to look at. But we need to move on. The last graph I want to show you is gonna compare the chroma values this time. Once again, the higher chroma values might be unrealistic, so don't focus too much on the upper and right areas. There are some weird effects that we haven't seen before, like when I use somewhat high perceptual lightness values and shift the hues in particular ways, then we get this weird box-like shape. Some kind of strange RGB effect again. It might also have to do with the fact that the hue in HCL is defined slightly differently. I am not entirely sure. As before, combining dark colors just gives us black, basically. And the chroma value is higher if similar hues are combined, while opposite hues can cancel each other out and even lead to gray colors. I'm gonna do some automated cycling again for this graph, mostly just because it's neat to look at. This is way too much all over the place to draw specific conclusions though. However, that in itself is a valuable piece of information. The vividness of your colors is also an enormously important factor, and since the chroma values are so unpredictable here, you should rely first and foremost on your eyes. This also goes for the perceptual lightness. Your trained eyes, if you have no color vision impairment that is, are still the best tools for finding the best color combinations. And so we have gone through all the different graphs and looked at how all sorts of parameters that describe a color change because of the color burn calculations. We have seen some rather extreme results, so this blending mode is definitely among the harder ones to work with, but it can still be useful, and in the following part I'll show you a couple of examples and tips. I prepared some drawings and chose a couple of photos that we will edit with the help of color burn. Firstly, I'll use this simple drawing of my little mink mascot wearing lots of kimono layers with different colors. I chose this kind of design simply because I could combine lots of different colors this way. There are 5 different versions: pastel, neutral, neon, dark and mixed colors. Let's start with the pastel version. And firstly, I'd like to add some texture. I have these paper textures, which are mostly white with some light gray texture. Gonna set them to color burn, and, well, not all that much has changed. That's because color burn has less of an effect on bright base colors, so the texture does not get evenly applied. And perhaps that is something you wanted to do, to apply more texture to the darker colors. We're gonna leave these texture layers as they are. I'm also gonna test a more colorful and uneven watercolor texture. You see that there are very bright and very dark spots. And also some spots appear more colorful and vivid than others. Now if I switch the blending mode to color burn, things look quite differently. Mainly just darker parts of the texture show up. But some of those dark parts really darken the image. Color-wise, it's also kind of all over the place. The spots that were less colorful basically just make the underlying color darker, while the more vivid spots overpower the base colors. You could get some interesting results this way. I personally don't like how this looks even with lower opacity, so I'll turn it off again. Now we're gonna use several layers to add shadows, highlights, glow effects, particles, and so on. All those that are supposed to darken will be set to color burn and will attempt to find the best colors to use. At first, some subtle gradients. I usually use those to make the colors less flat looking. By the way, everything is already pre-made. The only thing I do is pick a color that gets applied to the entire blending layer. Alright, so here we can already see the first issue. The fur color of the little mink is pure white. This means that the color burn layers have absolutely no effect on it whatsoever. Even if I choose black, the face remains unchanged. Now I could go and change the fur color to be slightly darker, but I'm doing this for demonstration purposes, to also show you the flaws of this blending mode. So all the base colors will stay as they are, and we have to find the best compromise that we can. And so I'll choose a light color so that the fact that it has no effect on the white fur isn't too noticeable. Next up the shadows, which are just one solid color with some hatching texture. Once again it has no effect on the white color, which puts me into a dilemma because I could go for a very light color, but then we would barely have any contrast. Or make it a bit darker, making the lack of shadows on the face stand out even more. It's not just the fur color that causes us troubles. Look at the yellow fabric against the background panel. The base colors are not that far apart in terms of brightness, but the shadows have very different darkness values on each of those surfaces. If I choose a dark gray, this becomes really evident. Now since the colors are so bright, their hues don't play too much of a role. So I could use any hues for the shadows and it would not completely destroy my contrasts based on the hue differences. Also, the issue with the shadows being differently bright for the clothes and the back panels becomes less of an issue if I choose a highly saturated color. The saturations can be quite different though. I'm gonna choose this purple magenta color. Not optimal, but it's the best I can do. The next layers are highlights applied with a screen blending mode, and a rim light using a glow dodge layer, which is the same as a linear dodge. Then some line colors, some decorative shapes, and a subtle glow effect. I'm just skipping over these because in other videos these blending modes will be explained in detail. Right now we're just mainly focusing on color burn. The next layer that is supposed to darken colors is the vignette layer. It's just a round gradient that makes the corners darker. And the effect that brighter colors get less darkened comes into play here again. Therefore, a color burn is not all that well suited for a vignette effect. I'll just keep it on and use a somewhat bright purple so that it's noticeable but doesn't mess around with the contrasts too much. And lastly, I'm adding my artist name tag with a color burn layer too, which can be done easily since the base colors are quite bright after all. It's easy and clear to read. Also, I have a fill layer here set to the color blending mode to unify the colors a little bit more. Alright, this was the first example. It's definitely quite a difference to the original with only the base colors. One could say that it's an improvement despite the difficulties. It depends on your personal taste. And I personally would say that there are better blending modes than color burn for all those purposes. But you can work with it to some degree. It's just very hard to predict the results, and if you work with very bright colors or even straight up white, it will have barely to no effect on those base colors. Let me quickly show you the other examples. I won't go through every single layer again, but instead mostly just focus on the shadows. Here I have a version with neutral colors. That means that the colors have very little saturation. And through the blending modes I created this version. Looks almost ghostly. Now you can already tell that especially the bright colors have barely been affected by the color burn layers. The innermost kimono layers, for example, have very little texture on them. And the white fur once again remained unchanged. Therefore those bright colors really stand out and almost look like they're glowing. For the shadows I used a very bright color, almost white even, and it still created such clear drop shadows. That's because the underlying colors were already quite dark, which, as we learned, enhances the darkening effect of color burn even more. If I go for a medium bright color, we mostly end up with black now, which, well, doesn't mean that it looks bad, but this might not be what you wanna go for. The diamond shapes on the clothes are an issue here because they're much brighter. There are cases where the kimono gets darkened to black while those shapes remain mostly unchanged. And if you use a hue color or something close to it, everything basically gets tinted at hue, with varying brightnesses. Well, except for the face, still. But let me go to the color I had before, because that one was subtle enough for my tastes. By the way, I would not recommend using a darkening blending mode for your name tag if you place it over a dark area. Should be pretty obvious, but I'm still pointing that out. The next one looks quite flashy, because here I used a bunch of neon colors. So colors that are very close to the hue colors and are therefore very highly saturated, very vivid. Here's the version with all the blending layers. It's gonna get chaotic. First up, you can notice that the green pattern basically remained unaltered by the shadows. That is even the case when I use a really dark color. Only when I reach a certain threshold, the green suddenly turns black too. But the red on the fans and brush tip did not change at all, even when we use black. I can also use some hue colors for the shadows, which gives us some extreme RGB effects. But the red still remains unchanged. What's going on? Let's take a closer look at those base colors. With the settings of my eyedropper tool, I can pick the color of only the selected layer, which is the base color layer in this case. As you can see, all the colors are very close to the upper right corner of this HSV color picker, so close to the hue color. The red, however, is actually pure red, which makes it immune to any sort of change by the color burn layers. Interesting is also that it seems to matter quite a lot if the color is slightly brighter than the hue color or slightly darker. Like this magenta versus the green. As I already explained, the green barely gets affected either. So if you're working with color burn layers, try to avoid having pure hue colors. Just like pure white, they don't get affected at all. Another thing is also that the colors still remain very highly saturated overall. So yeah, neon colors on your base color layers can be quite difficult to work with in this case. Next up, a lot of very dark colors. Now, since all the colors are far away from white and the hue colors, everything should work alright, right? Let's turn on the blending layers, and, well, at first glance it seems okay. The contrast mostly comes from the brightening layers this time, but those are not what we are focusing on. This time the face finally got some shadows too. And the colors have been darkened somewhat consistently. Not perfect, but good enough. You don't have much range to work with though, because just a little bit darker already means that the shadows just turn all black. Oh yeah, and the name tag really should not be using a darkening blending mode here. And you should still stay away from the hue colors or anything close to them. Look at this case when I choose red, for example. The red parts of the clothes almost have no shadows at all now. Now usually you're not working with exclusively dark colors. Often you're gonna have some kind of mix of bright and dark colors. So let me show you this mixed version here. The clothes have a gradient from a darker blue-green to the bright looking hue color and some even brighter yellow patterns. The head decoration also used some hue colors. And the other colors are kind of all over the place. So quite a mix, while I still try to make sure that the colors look at least somewhat good next to each other. Now let's turn on the blending layers. Okay, at first glance it might not look too bad, sort of magical even, but there are a couple of inconsistencies. First of all, you can see that the yellow pattern and the brighter clothing layers have been barely affected by the color burn layers. Now, if you want to make them glowy looking or something, then that's fine. But if not, then this is a major issue. It could look like I simply forgot to draw some of the shadows. And things get quite extreme if you use highly saturated bright colors again. Now, the yellow pattern barely gets affected, but all the clothes have black shadows now. Except for the innermost layer, which has green shadows now. I think you just should avoid hue colors. So yeah, if you're aiming specifically to make dark colors darker while barely affecting the brighter colors, then color burn can be useful. I would not really recommend it as a blending mode for shadows, vignettes or the like. You can definitely experiment around with it though, like for applying extreme looking textures, this can be sort of interesting. It is hard to predict though, so experimentation is going to be necessary. Alright, next I'd like to show you some more techniques for using color burn with a couple of photos as examples. I switched to Photoshop just to mix things up. It doesn't really matter what graphics program I use. Let's start with this photo of a lovely flower. It looks nice, but perhaps it could use a bit more contrast and vividness. One thing you could do is duplicate the photo and set the upper one to color burn. Now this is a bit extreme, lots of black now. So reduce the opacity until you get an optimal looking result. This will darken the shadows while leaving the bright parts mostly untouched and adds a bit of vividness too. Another way to do this is by using an adjustment layer and setting it to color burn, like a tone curve, hue saturation and many others. Not only would this save space, since you don't have the same large image twice in your project, but you would also get a couple of extra adjustment options. If I lower the saturation, for example, it once again mostly just affects the darker colors. Therefore, the bright and vivid color in the foreground doesn't only pop more because of a stronger brightness contrast, but also a stronger color contrast. And if I feel like there's too much green, I could shift the hue. There we go. I would say that this is actually a significant improvement. Now here is a photo of my two late cats, Hanami and Hoko. If you watched some of my older videos, then you know these two cuties. Now in this case, I'll use a fill layer and set it to color burn. Any kind of darker and highly saturated colors are pretty useless here. However, a light color can be used to increase the contrast by making the darker colors even darker and tinting the image in the hue you chose. I'm gonna choose a warm bright orange to make the whole image look like it has been taken next to a cozy fireplace or something like that. Also quite a difference to the original. Another idea would be to add some shapes as backgrounds for text. Just gonna pick a color that doesn't completely result in black but still makes everything dark enough so that the bright text on top of it is easy to read. This does not always work since it very strongly depends on the base colors. If there are any bright colors below, then they'll stay mostly bright and the text would be hard to read. Alright, now let's draw some conclusions from these examples. Color burn is honestly rather limited in its uses, since it doesn't evenly darken and it is quite unpredictable. However, it would be useful for some flashy looking textures, or if you want your texture mostly affected darker colors. In combination with adjustment layers, it can be useful if you again want to retain the brighter colors of your base color layers. I showed you an example with hue saturation, but this also works with others like the tone curve or levels, giving you control over how the colors get changed. Well, and those are my main recommendations. I personally would use different blending modes for purposes like shading, vignettes or gradients. Those will or already do have their own tutorial videos that you can watch. And not only that, but comparison videos are also part of the series. For example, I will compare color burn directly with the other darkening blending modes like multiply, darken and linear burn. Alright, that's all I have to show about color burn, at least for now. I tried to make it as detailed as possible and include lots of examples that I deemed useful, But if you have any other tips and feedback, then you are more than welcome to share your knowledge down below in the comments. Thank you a lot for watching, and see you next time.